What I'm going to talk about now today is around that issue of serendipity in doctoral education. It's of slightly different order to the talks which I think have come so far. And some of you may have seen some of the material in this from the article which has been published in between the initial conference being due last year and the revamp of the conference now. I've put my email address on there if anybody wants to get a copy of it and can't access it. But I'm not going to focus entirely on the article. It's more to do with where we're going next. But just in terms of a little bit of background, my PhD, which was back in the 80s, I was struggling with the idea of how do you relate three things: party ideology, dominant social culture, and party organization. And I was swanning around for far too long, as my PhD supervisor would have told me, without knowing what to do. Done lots of surveys, huge amounts of reading, hadn't a clue what to actually do with it. And then I came across this magnificent book, which I bought in 2 or 3 years before in an Amnesty International jumble sale. And I was sitting in my study, looking out over the river that we live next to, and thinking, I have no idea what I'm going to do. Let me just pick something up off the bookshelf. The pink on this appealed to me. I picked it up, opened it up, and in the same way as Mr. Natural here has suddenly appeared with an idea, everything sort of fell into place. And Kuhn, as you know, introduced the notion of the paradigm. And for me, what happened here was that the paradigm became the macro concept, and ideology, organization, dominant culture became meso concepts. And in that way, I could relate those various aspects to it. So that was partly where I started thinking about the notions of chance in doctoral education. It was to do with mine, but it's also impacted on me personally. This, as you will recognize, is a railway station. It's actually a railway station in the town that has is proud to proclaim that it was the home of the first passenger railway in the world. It's in Darlington. And if you look here very carefully, you'll see that there is a chocolate machine there. And just after I'd started university, I was standing near the chocolate machine, and I noticed somebody having difficulty getting the chocolate out of it. And I went over and banged the machine, and it gave up its chocolate. And about 2 years later, this is what happened. So it was rather an interesting activity. And again, a little piece of serendipity. Was it chance? Was it luck? Or was it serendipity? And I'll leave you to think about that. Having sort of put that, but there's been an awful lot of other bits and pieces in my life which seem to have emerged out of serendipity, but I didn't know what to call it until I'd stumbled across the Merton and Barber book on serendipity, which is a wonderful read, great thing to go through. And this article came out of it. So a couple of items from this. Firstly, I was asking people who'd undertaken doctoral study, whether or not serendipity had played a part in their studies. I talked to people and they were saying, yes, it had bits and pieces, but there was no literature, and there was nobody had actually looked at doctoral students and serendipity. What they tended to look at was big science, big inventions, big events. Everybody knows about Pasteur and the others, but in terms of the everyday incidents of science at the ground level of doctoral education, not very many people seem to know. And so I asked them what had been the effect of serendipity if it occurred. And as you can see, the types of effects were spread across a fairly broad spectrum. What did it actually involve? These were the figures. The biggest ones you can see was coming across an unanticipated, unsearched for article or piece of writing or whatever. Very little in terms of malfunction of equipment. And it went on and so on. And these bundled together into the major areas were around literature and ideas, project-related artifacts, just bumping into things, invitations, introductions, and being in the right place at the right time. And then something which I hadn't seen commented on, which was secondhand serendipity, which involved somebody else recognizing something that might be useful for somebody and then passing it on. So overall, what I found in the survey, and I've still got some work to do on the data, is, as we know, it requires somebody or an associated other to recognize the potential value. It involves, as Ron was talking about, the social context and actors other than the doctoral students. It's a social phenomenon. And it shifts this focus away from just the researcher as an extraordinary person onto the contextual elements of the phenomenon. And I think that socializing of serendipity is important. So to move rapidly to today's argument, I'm a bit worried about doctoral education. Increasingly, they're viewed as being processual and linear in nature. And if you look at the how to get a PhD, how to supervise a PhD literature, they all assume that there is a linear process through which doctoral students will go on a journey. I much prefer the notion of a quest because it's much less deterministic, but that can be found in the how-to literature. It's also found in the processes we put in place within universities for doctoral students as they progress through their study. Subject to the early development of a fairly well-defined program of work, which again relates back to the comment I made on Ron's presentation, that if we plan things, we tend to plan out chance to a large degree. Increasingly, doctoral studies are viewed as preparation for work training, rather than research education and training in thinking. And increasingly, we're piling more things into the doctoral program, the program of studies, including taught elements, employment-related activities, placements, etc., etc. We're removing the space from the doctoral graduate study. And we've also got increased demands from governments for timely completion, which again places the constraints around the practice of doctoral education. And then, so finally, what we've got in terms of that is this looking for an outcome within a very strict time frame. And Alcock, I've only got a couple of quotes in here, but this one I was particularly taken by, that we should listen to the rumbles coming in that serendipity in a strong sense is under threat. Technological innovations play an important role here. As budgets tighten, as they're happening across the world, research expectations narrow, training specializes, the relaxed ability sagaciously to recognize happy accidents and the time and support to chase them seems imperiled. And so there are some implications, and this is what the next part of the writing out of this will move on to, is there are implications for institutions, funders, and supervisors in these changing times, particularly if we think that doctoral education is about creativity and about developing that creative thought which serendipity feeds into. Firstly, to make sure that students are given time. Secondly, that they're given opportunities to attend and create, and opportunities to meet others, other PhDs, other people within networks, etc., etc. Crucially, that we need to support those outside the norm. So part-timers who actually about 45% of PhD students are part-timers. There are those with caring responsibilities, etc., to allow them to do the sort of networking that's required. And then for supervisors particularly, to recognise their role in what I've termed secondhand serendipity. One of the respondents to the survey, and again, I like this, I've included it in the article, but they said, now that I've seen the mention of coming across unanticipated research, I understand your definition differently. There must be dozens of examples where something I was reading, even if it was popular news rather than academic literature, ended up casting a new angle on the way I thought about research. I think a PhD teaches you to form these connections spontaneously. It happens when you're so immersed in your project, you see answers to the research question everywhere. And that matched my experience. Things would just bounce in and sparks would go off. So was it chance? Not really. Luck? Not really. Serendipity? Yep, you bet your life it was. There's an awful lot of it about, and we really need to create the conditions for it. So any questions or comments? And I will really stop sharing, I think. Yay.
Thank you so much. Well, we have the answer here, but we'll go on asking, but in the spirit of serendipity and creativity. Another round of applause here. I'm very diligent. And does anyone have? We have about 5 minutes. Any questions for Alistair, or sharing some experiences perhaps of doing research, doctoral or any type of research? So I'm monitoring if there is any hand raised. There are a few applauses. Well, just picking up a little bit from where Ron discussed as well. I mean, all these connections are kind of coming together, and it's interesting to see in some ways. I mean, maybe this is obviously a misconception, because at all levels, education includes both more convergent and more divergent kind of elements. But it almost seemed to me, at least from my experience, that when you start education, kindergarten or very, very early on, and then when you end it, you have like a parallel of certain kinds of freedom that maybe you don't often get in the middle somehow. But the more we think about how a PhD process and the end point of education is being kind of the way we're pushed into very specific research fields, research questions, methodologies, all these fight to just do one thing, to specialize in one thing. We see that actually there is not such freedom. We're not back in kindergarten in any way in many cases. I think. I don't know. What do you think, Alistair? Have you thought about these parallels that might happen between very early, mid-level, and have you thought of extending maybe the scope of your research too?
It's interesting. It brings to mind some of Ivan Illich's comments about how formal education trains people out of thinking and into other things. I'm paraphrasing it very badly there, but it's always struck me that doing a doctorate should be about a very normative view of it, but it should be about thinking widely and exposing yourself to lots of things. And I think in part that also allies to my notion, the idea that if a PhD doesn't change the way that you're thinking, it's not a proper PhD. So that I came out of mine thinking completely differently. I mean, structurally, I think in many ways, to the way I went in. It changes you as a person. And while that's probably more true about humanities, social science degrees, I think it should also be there for STEM degrees, because there should be something about the philosophy of science, the structure of knowledge. But increasingly, I think those parts are being left out. I think they're probably still in continental Europe to a greater degree, but I think in the Anglo tradition, they've sort of slipped away to a large extent. And so you can get through a PhD in nowadays without actually looking at the PH bit, the philosophy part.
Right, absolutely. I see a comment from Margaret talking about training us out of wondering. You know, wonder and wondering are fascinating to me. And if anyone has the energy to stay until the very end, I'm going to talk a little bit about them at the end. But do you have any final thoughts you think about kind of how do we infuse uncertainty more and the sense of wonder? Because you've obviously talked and you know, kind of related to the experience of many people, but would we have something concrete that we could do maybe as people who are around PhD students or some supervising PhD research?
Yeah, I mean, that's partly why I was taken by Ron's stuff so much, that I'd have incorporated something around the, he's talking about, you know, emergent events, designing for uncertainty. But the problem is, if you want somebody to guarantee to produce an 80 to 100,000 word piece at the end of it, you design risk out of it. So if a PhD student comes to me with an idea which is speculative, my rational approach, particularly when I'm going to be judged on the time that that student will take to complete, is to go, no, you really don't want to do this. You want to do this, which is very simple, guaranteed. You will get an answer out of it. Right. And it drives the creativity out of it, or transfers the ownership of the PhD from me to the supervisor. Right. And it's in part, that's always been the case in STEM. There's always been an element of that, but it's now creeping into the humanities, social sciences. The student who comes in and says, I want to do something on Shakespeare. And that's what's starting point. And then, okay, you can have a grant and then we'll support you to do something on Shakespeare. That's not good enough. You've got to have a plan of where you're going to get to at the end. And as I say, that's like a journey. It's like you go on a journey, you get on the bus, you pay your money, you get off at the other end and you know where you were going to. Whereas the PhD should be more like a quest where there is something there, but it's fairly amorphous. And you're not quite sure where it is. You're not quite sure what the impact will be. And you have no real idea what the journey is going to be like. And that you get off at the other end and you're a different person. You know, think of Lord of the Rings. The characters who get to the end in that. Right. They're different from the people who started. Yeah. They're different hobbits.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alistair. And you know, this is excellent when we scheduled kind of all the events of a week into 24 hours. The biggest criteria was time and geography in some ways. So we have the Australian group of papers, and then we have kind of Arizona kind of matching them, and we'll have now Dana and Punya joining us. So I think they're already here. But what I find interesting is that serendipitously, we actually bridge all these topics and we build kind of towards an argument somehow, because we're going to keep on talking about designing for serendipity. So thank you very much for these thoughts. And I think I'm going to